Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome from Adelaide, South Australia, Beata Luks. Welcome, Beata.
Hello.
Good morning. Now, I wanted to bring up a screen, and I'm just going to throw it over the top of us because I think it's really important. I'm going to leave the heading up deliberately. War as a racket, government as convenience. Last night, we watched Hallmark, and in our Hallmark movies, there's this series called Signed, Sealed, Delivered about these postal investigators who are in the lost mail department, and they go about um, finding the owners of mails using the using investigation and things like that, and all the facilities that are available to them to do it. Now, what I find most important about this particular movie was that because I'm actually reading a lot of other books, if you like, I was analysing the video to see if there was an element of propaganda. And unfortunately, I found that it was entirely propaganda driven. So I'm going to get cut across to the to a website and just bring up some other books as a reference, as a starting point to what we're talking about. So we go across to here and we look at this War is a Racket by General Smedley Darlington Butler, a most decorated soldier, and he writes about the involvement of exploitation, if you like, the racketeering that's gone on in war, about supplies of materials, about the exploitation of the community to harness them to buy war bonds and things like that. And no matter which way it turns, every opportunity is exploited. And Butler goes on and also talks about the truth of war. And of course, the truth of war is that the soldiers are actually mobilized. They're taught, they're trained how to kill and to expect to be in a killing environment for several years at a time, a killing environment. In other words, they get up every day and they kill someone, or they attempt to kill someone, or someone is attempting to kill them. And that is what they do every single day. Now, that is a most important point because this affects every single family. Killing Hope, William Blum, he talks about and writes about the US military and CIA intervention since World War II, and there's a documentary book of American involvement and how intrusive it has been. Its history, America is one of war, it is a mongrel for war, and it will continue to be. Now, I did a search on the Veritas Books website under the name of Sutton, Anthony Sutton being the author. And there's actually, I think it was 9 books, 9 results there. Two Faces of Bush, How the Order Creates War and Revolution, The Secret Cult of the Order, How the Order Controls Education, The Federal Reserve Conspiracy. Interesting, deeply interesting. Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. Actually, financial and military support to develop Hitler, and Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. Exactly the same. Financial and military aid to establish the um, Bolshevik Revolution. An introduction to the order, and finally, national suicide, military aid to the Soviet Union. These are very, very important books. Anthony Sutton being a professor, and he presented it, I believe, to Congress. He actually stated what was going on to Congress, and to deaf ears, they did nothing. Veritas Books does carry some of the Sutton, as I said, nine books there, and they're currently in a there's a sale going on, end of financial year, and so that's important. And finally, the last part of our heading, which is actually the first part, this difficult individual, Ezra Pound. I found a copy of this book at Book Depository. So why is that important? Why is it important? And why is signed, sealed, delivered, the Hallmark movies so important? In my view, it's because they present a narrative of war as somehow being romantic, of somehow being that government is compassionate and understanding and attempting to save lost souls, and it's at the highest ideals of, if you like, American virtue. And it's presented there as this is the everyday running of government, when in actual fact, if you look at the Butler's book, War is a Racket, it's war as a racket. War is actually as a racket. And so is the work of Anthony Sutton and Ezra Pound. Government as convenience. It paints an entirely different perspective on war. Now, right now, we're hearing, if you like, the thunder of war in the background with Donald Trump and Iran, and the mainstream media and the if you like, the complicit behaviour of mainstream media to beat the drums of war with Iran, and I find that insidious. It's absolutely insidious because it affects every single family, every single home, and the individuals not only involved participating in any war campaign, but also the communities that are just torn apart, the nations that are torn apart. And this is only from the West perspective. But what about those countries that are actually at the receiving end of this policy and the individuals and the families and the homes there? It's an entirely different picture. And I put it to you that the title is correct. War as a racket. Whereas Ezra Pound says government as a convenience. It's entirely different perspective on both. Your thoughts, Beata?
Well, I'm thinking at the moment that on the history of America, and it shows clearly that at the base of all the problems is the money question and money creation and shortage of money and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm,
Americans at the very beginning understood that question, and they tried to, and they successfully did circulate their own means of exchange
mm-hmm,
of produce and products and labor and what have you. Um, but of course, being dependent on the King of England, they were also dependent on Bank of England, and hence the war war broke out, didn't it?
mm-hmm,
So that's the beginning of that nation, basically.
mm-hmm,
And the policy hasn't changed. As for financing the war, brings in the credits into the community,
mm,
makes lots of people very, very wealthy,
mm-hmm,
and of course, trashes the communities,
mm,
killing people and taking away the breadwinners and destroying the bond between people and shifting them around and dumping them somewhere else. And it's totally destructive to both ends, as you say.
mm. Yeah.
So then, of course, in American history, 1913 happened when Reserve Bank was formed
Mm-hmm,
under pretenses of regulating, lots of arguments that don't even hold water. Yet the President Wilson was convinced by the powers above him that this is the only way to go. And ever since, that policy actually dictates that America has to rely on its military power and military industrial complex to run the economy.
mm. That's
They're
a
closing down, yeah, that's
mm,
they're closing down every other aspect of production but military complex.
mm. That's fascinating, Beata, because the I'm going to cut across. I've actually got the Federal Reserve conspiracy open there on the Veritas Books website. Professor Anthony Sutton, writing about it, 1913. And it's fascinating because you've touched on some profound points. One I think is worth repeating, that the American economy survives because of the military industrial complex. They actually put butter on bread and butter on the table of the American people by blowing up other countries. Now, isn't that absolute madness? Why just not make bread and butter available and set the financial system in right order? It's an exploitation of the, if you like, the chronic shortage of purchasing power in the hands of the community, in the hands of the individual. I mentioned the other day Chicago and Detroit, huge
Yeah.
car manufacturing bases that have been shut down in America. And yet the people are unemployed and they can't get bread and butter on their table unless these industries are going. And it's a false argument. The argument being, if you shall not work, you shall not eat. That's a false argument. In this day of automation, robotics, advanced control, less and less people are required to produce what's needed. Now, 150 years ago, I'll say it again, 150 years, that's not very long in the history of man. 150 years ago, 85% of the population was involved in agriculture. Now it's less than 5%, from 85% down to 5% to produce all the necessary food and export food for the whole nation. So if 5% of the population are producing enough food with advanced control, robotics, um, then surely the other 95% are entitled to feast on that produce. They should be entitled to it without having to make bombs, make bullets, and blow up other countries in order to get bread and butter on the table. It's a completely false narrative. A completely false narrative. Now, just take the step back to what I said about the Signed, Sealed, Delivered, the Hallmark movies. They present this romantic view of the bad guys in some other country. There's always bad guys in some other country. And the righteous American troops are going there to do the impossible. The Rangers, I think it was, do the impossible, and of course to save other people and from themselves. And they're going in there. But in actual fact, as General Butler says, they're just a killing machine, and they stay in that mode of killing for years at a time. And when they come back, they're broken bodies, they're lost limbs, lost eyes, lost minds because they can't break out of the narrative of being a killing machine and then coming back into a society. And they ask the question to themselves, what the dickens was all that about? Beata ever.
Yes. Well, blowing other people around to smithereens, then brings in consequence all those homeless, all those searching for way out, or there might be people over there that help the Americans or Australians or others that are involved in the war, and then they need to be brought to us on this side because otherwise they'll be in danger. And the narrative is repeated all the time. um, we really haven't got the truth about it
Mm,
at all.
hmm
It's you only need to look at the language of it all. It's the theater of war. Theater. What does it conjure up? What images?
hmm
Is it even real? It's almost as if they're mocking us with those terms,
hmm
or friendly wars, or that kind of language
hmm
which sort of softens it, but makes it ridiculous. I'm
mm,
sorry,
mm,
nobody buys it anymore.
mm. Yeah, that's right. I mean, we go to the First World War. What was the outcome of the First World War? The establishment of the Bolsheviks in Russia. That's what the First World War was about. The world is exhausted from a world war, and you've got communism on just the eastern side of Europe. There it is. The Second World War, to expand those communist borders to include most of Eastern Europe. And that's exactly what happened. Poland, I mean, the justification for going into the war was that the invasion of Poland. What happened at the end of the war? It was handed over. I mean, Russia moved into the war only at the end of the war, and all they did was establish the border, the new borders. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland. These countries were all incorporated. East Germany were all incorporated within the communist empire. So the Second World War was to expand the communist empire. Now what are we looking at? We're looking at the Iron Curtain has come down, but it hasn't, because if we look at our mainstream media, we look at our politicians, we look at our education systems, really indoctrination systems, you realize that the communist expansion is now including the entire world. This isn't funny. This is real. This is strategic outcome. So when you look at war, they talk about war is a racket. General Butler talks about war is a racket. The whole thing is a racket. It's exploitation to bring about political ends. And we really need to rethink the narrative, and certainly the narrative that the mainstream media, in this case, the righteousness of war as a narrative is there to exploit the situation, and it's nothing like that at all, as General Butler shows in his book. It's only a short book, but it's well worth a read because you realize that, hang on, this is nothing like I expected. Beatka.
Mm. Well, both world wars were actually to bring in America, to draw them in, because they could, with their production strength, with the output of the entire production, they could support those wars
Mm-hmm.
that could go on forever,
Mm,
and it did.
mm,
5 years
mm,
each time. Yes. Well, um, you mentioned Ezra Pound,
mm-hmm,
and this is a very, very interesting subject because he was very critical of American policy, and especially financial policy, because he understood that it serves the interests of the small group, if you wish.
mm-hmm,
But the consequence of debt collection, or increment of debt, national debt, is something that generations will be responsible for, and will have to carry on their shoulders. And we see it, of course, in every country anyway.
mm,
Um, so his critics were shaking in their boots, because he was so outspoken.
mm,
He has written about it. He has said it in his radio broadcasts, and hence he was put away for 13 years without trial, locked into the psychiatric hospital
mm,
for 13 years.
mm,
And then they had to let him go, but on his terms.
mm,
His terms.
mm,
So when they exhausted I don't know, they strength of conviction on a subject, or whatever you can call it, they let him go finally,
mm. Yeah,
but
that,
without any trial or anything. That
eh,
the charges were actually withdrawn.
yeah,
But of course, if you speaking, and it was a massive campaign to um, make him basically a what do you call it, treasonous person.
mm-hmm,
It was a massive campaign for that many years. That his reputation was really destroyed.
mm,
Um, but for the few people who were his friends, who were constantly in contact with him, and who understood.
mm, mm.
Mm.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your comments, Bianca. I think that Ezra Pound, he's saying government as convenience. It paints an entirely different narrative on the relationship between the individual and government. What we have imposed on us is essentially a totalitarian government, whether it's in America or whether it's behind the Iron Curtain, China, whatever. It's totalitarian government. And Australia, Australia is not avoiding this. Australia is not avoiding this. All the things that, if you like, the socialist governments want implemented, they just get the conservative governments to do. And of course, the narrative is accepted. Oh well, that's just the way it is. I mean, the conservatives are doing the right thing. They're doing nothing like it. The conservatives are, if you like, involved in the narrative, completely involved, immersed in it. And of course, the mainstream media paint them in such a light that it's acceptable. Signed, sealed, delivered. Hallmark. Propaganda. This is Arnie Luks and Beata Luks at the Crossroads. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.